What is tinkering?
Oh, that is such a tricky question. It escapes definition in some ways. A lot of people think of tinkering as a whole set of concerns. So you might be salvaging, you might be inventing things, upcycling things, crafting or building. But the people in my book regarded tinkering as a way of life, as a vocation.
And you use the term in your book. I think you nicked it, which is part of the old tinkering philosophy, I imagine. Tinkering mindset.
Yes, I shamelessly nicked that term from a great tinkerer called Mark Thompson. So, yeah, there's a whole tinkering mindset that says, you know, we don't have to take the world as it comes. We can open up the covers. We can tool around with things. You know, if my door handle breaks, I'm not going to call someone. I'm going to work out how this thing works. So that whole mindset I found among the people featured in my book isn't just a mindset towards material things, but also to political engagement with the world, yeah.
It's like this subculture, for me anyway, who can fix nothing, like this subculture that sort of does connect with the whole Australian ethos as well in some way, and you have particularly focused on Australia.
Yep, I have focused on Australia, but there is a long tradition of tinkering here, and there's actually a bit of a migration from the word tinker to tinkerer. In the Depression era, tinkers were a profession. They were travellers, like the Irish travellers. They were like gypsies, and they went round with vans around rural Australia fixing things. And there are people alive today who still remember the tinkers. But sometime in the Edwardian era, the word got its suffix, tinkerer, and that was someone who tinkered around with things at home. And of course, in wartime, tinkering was really valued, but in peacetime, less so, because, you know, the cultural agendas had changed.
And there's a difference between a tinkerer and someone who just has a hobby.
Yeah, I think so. Look, it's one of those shape-shifting definitions, but the people I feature in my book have this extraordinary commitment to do-it-yourself culture. They kind of focus their whole lives around it. So they don't have an approach towards vocation that a lot of us do. They tend to work in creative industries in the gig economy, so their central life focus is making stuff, but they fit their work lives around it, and many of them actually make money. You know, I was talking to a tinkerer this morning, actually, who she said you have to have 7 streams of income to survive, and her tinkering, she does earn money from her tinkering. She does gardening and artworks and all sorts of things, but she also participates in grey economies or informal economies that rely on systems of exchange that aren't monetised.
I love that. Dr. Kath Wilson is our guest on ABC Radio Perth and Western Australia. She's the author of Tinkering, Australians Reinvent DIY Culture. I'm Jill. Now, and it's interesting, you know, you talk about them fitting work around their leisure time, whereas it has been the norm for so long for people to try and sort of squeeze in what they do outside their main job as they see it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, there's this term that floats around all the time. What is it? The work-life balance. And, you know, that implies that life is oppositional to work. And when you think about that, it's not a very healthy way to think about the world, because it presumes that leisure is this compensatory break from, you know, the toil that is work. And to the people in my book, work itself is leisure. They love what they do. It's work that isn't toil. It's leisure, but it has a purpose. So all those definitions are kind of broken down, and it's an approach to life that works very well in a precarious labour market.
I really love the sense of curiosity. If there's a human quality about the tinkerer, it is this sense of curiosity about how things work.
That's right. It's play. This is the lovely thing about it. It's curiosity. It's tenacity. It's not accepting rules. So it's, you know, a lot of the people in my book were actually doing illegal things like rewiring their houses and so on, and you can understand why those things are really regulated. But the whole tinkering mindset kind of has an anti-authoritarian larrikin street, really. And a lot of the people just ignored those kind of rules and warranty waivers and so on, often not always to good effect. But the interesting thing about the tinkering mindset is that failure is welcomed. Failure is seen as an opportunity to learn, and some industries actually embrace that idea, like engineering. There's this mantra in engineering, and it's fail early, fail often. Failure is actually seen as its own success because you learn stuff. Yeah.
So it's about the process, not about the outcome necessarily.
Not necessarily, that's right. The interesting thing is that one of the tinkerers in my book, Addis Hondo, spent months and painful hours trying to make a Steadicam for a project he was using. And in the end, he couldn't make it. He had to give up. And a lot of us wouldn't invest that amount of time for such a risky enterprise that was unlikely to succeed. But the people featured in my book just didn't approach things that way. They didn't see that as wasted time. They saw it as instructive. And I describe tinkering as a form of scholarship in that. And that sense of purpose just out of attempting something is very real for these people.
And I love that just the idea of goodwill becomes in this process a form of economy in itself. And that is in a sense an old-fashioned idea. It probably hasn't been particularly long in history where we've had this very consumer economy. So that's almost been the odd point out in our history, because I think that culture of goodwill is actually probably older and more sustainable than the corporate culture.
So.
Yeah,
absolutely, I think so. And it's interesting. One of my one protagonist in the book, she described her tinkering project. She said when it gets to a certain commercial momentum, when she was jewellery making, she was making preserves, she was making all sorts of things. But she said that the minute someone gives her a commission and when it becomes a big project, there is something actually lost. When it becomes a monetised project, this isn't a romantic notion of some kind of purity away from the market. It was a very real thing. When there's the pressures that are associated with professional outcomes, there's very often, the joy of making is lost. Yeah.
And we're not talking about either, I think people would tend to think of a particular kind of, easygoing hippie sort of lifestyle. But wasn't that woman a scientist before she...
That's right. Yeah. She was a senior research scientist. And there a lot of the people I interviewed had kind of gigs in professional fields, but they were dispersed. There was no specialisation. And I think that was what was really interesting, is that these were skilled generalists, and they did what academics call domain shifting. So they'd learn a skill in one area and they'd apply it to other areas. And there was one woman I featured in Brisbane, Kate O'Brien, who's a tremendous artist, but she would construct, she's called a fine art photographer, and she'd construct all her sets herself. She'd sew all her costumes herself. She'd make these stories. And she said photography is just a way to capture what I do. She didn't see photography as the end game. She didn't just define herself as a fine art photographer. Sourcing materials, engaging with the past by replicating old methods. That was the kind of stuff that gave her meaning in her projects, not just this artwork that would finally sell.
You can see a real purpose, a real meaning in life coming out of that kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a lot of people described it as a kind of psychological sanctuary away from the formal workplace. Gildas Vidigo, that senior research scientist I talked about, she found that there were many abstractions you deal with in the workplace, and putting a focus on something, a small closed world that is real in a material sense, kind of anchored her mind.
Okay, it's a brilliant book, and I just
thank you.
A great conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jill.